It was a quiet evening in September 1980 when the small town of Millhaven, Pennsylvania, wrapped itself in the calm of an early autumn night. Streetlights flickered across Main Street, their glow falling over parked cars and the faint sound of a jukebox inside a nearby diner. The air smelled faintly of rain and pine, the kind of stillness that made everyone feel safe. At 8:45 p.m., 24-year-old Clara Vance left her part-time shift at the Millhaven Library. She waved to her coworker, tucked her books under one arm, and started walking the familiar 2 blocks home. Clara was known for her gentle laugh and quiet warmth. She lived with her younger brother in a small brick house near the town center, where she kept a garden of daisies and mint. That night she never made it home. When the library lights dimmed behind her, the town seemed to swallow her footsteps. The next morning, her brother Daniel woke to find the house unusually silent. The coffee pot sat untouched on the counter. Clara's jacket hung by the door. Her library tote was missing, but her bicycle stood neatly in the garage. At first, he thought she might have gone out early for groceries, but as the morning hours passed, an uneasy feeling took root. By noon, Daniel walked to the police station. His voice trembled as he spoke to Officer Jim O'Neill, one of Millhaven's few full-time officers. "She's never done this before," Daniel said. "She's always home by 9. The officer listened carefully, scribbling notes. By evening, a small search team was formed: friends, neighbors, a few off-duty officers. They walked through the woods behind the library, along the trails near the creek, calling her name softly as dusk set in. Millhaven was a place where everyone knew everyone. When someone was missing, people noticed. Local shop owners closed early to help with the search. Volunteers brought flashlights and maps. The town that usually felt timeless suddenly felt uncertain. 2 days later, Clara's tote bag was found along the edge of a gravel path about a mile from the library. Inside were her books and a small silver pen engraved with her initials. But there were no signs of struggle, no footprints nearby. The police cordoned off the area, taking photographs and bagging the items carefully. As the days stretched into a week, the search widened. Helicopters flew over Millhaven's surrounding forest, and divers were sent to check the shallow parts of Deerfield Creek. Yet no new clues surfaced. Local newspapers printed her photograph beside the headline, "Millhaven Woman Missing After Library Shift." For many in the town, Clara's absence felt like a light had gone out. She had been a fixture at the library since high school, helping children find books and organizing community reading nights. Parents who had known her since she was a teenager stopped by the Vance home with meals, unsure what to say but wanting to help somehow. Daniel spent each evening sitting on the front porch, waiting. The porch light stayed on long after midnight, as though it could guide her home. Weeks passed and still there was no sign. The state police took over the case, adding resources and investigators from Harrisburg. Detective Elaine Porter, known for her calm precision, arrived to assist the local team. She reviewed every report, every interview, every map. "Someone saw something," she told her partner. "We just need to find who." But with no witnesses and no clear evidence, the case grew quiet. In late October, nearly 6 weeks after Clara's disappearance, a farmer named George Kinley called the police. He had been tending his fields near Millhaven Ridge when his tractor hit something unusual near the tree line. When he climbed down to check, he found what looked like pieces of fabric tangled beneath fallen leaves. Within hours, investigators arrived. The area was sealed off as a crime scene. Beneath the autumn canopy, the ground revealed the rest of what George had found, a shallow resting place hidden by branches and soil. Detective Porter knelt beside the scene, her breath still as she took in the small details. the edge of a familiar tote strap, a delicate silver pen nearby, and a faint pattern of pressed grass leading back toward the gravel path. By nightfall, the coroner's team confirmed what the town had feared. The remains matched the description of Clara Vance. Word spread quickly through Millhaven. People gathered outside the library, some leaving flowers by the steps. The church bell rang softly that evening, its sound echoing through the empty streets. The investigation deepened. Evidence was collected carefully: soil samples, fibers from the fabric, and several small objects found near the scene. Forensic testing in 1980 was limited compared to what would later become possible, but Detective Porter made sure every piece was documented and preserved. Interviews resumed with renewed urgency. Anyone who had seen Clara that night was asked to return to the station. A few witnesses recalled a dark-colored car parked along Oak Lane near the library, but none had seen who was inside. Others remembered hearing a sound, maybe a door closing, but nothing more. Despite weeks of effort, no direct lead emerged. As winter arrived, the investigation began to lose momentum. The case file grew thick, filled with reports, photographs, and typed statements. Detective Porter stayed in contact with Daniel, visiting the family home once a week to update him, even when there was little to say. By early 1981, the official search ended, though the case remained open. Life in Millhaven slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, but the sense of loss lingered. The library placed a small plaque near the front desk in Clara's memory. Children still came in to read, their laughter mixing softly with the turning of pages, but for those who knew her, every visit carried a trace of absence. Years passed. Technology changed. New faces joined the police department. The old case files were moved to an archive room in the county building, stored neatly in labeled boxes. Detective Porter retired in 1995, still carrying the memory of the young woman she could never forget. And for a long time, that was where the story stayed, resting in silence, waiting for someone new to listen again. But time, as always, has a way of circling back. In 2021, over 4 decades later, the Pennsylvania Bureau of Investigation launched a statewide initiative to revisit unsolved cases using new forensic tools. Among the hundreds of files submitted for review, one folder stood out to the team: Case 80 MV214, Missing Person, Clara Vance. A young forensic specialist named Tessa Rhodes, then 27, opened the file one morning in the evidence lab. Inside were the same brown envelopes sealed in 1980, their labels written in typewriter ink. One contained fabric fragments from Clara's jacket, another small bag held a few preserved samples from the scene. Tessa handled them carefully, documenting each step as she began preparing the materials for modern DNA analysis. The lab's equipment could now detect and map genetic traces far smaller than anything possible in 1980. Days later, the first test results came in. There was enough viable DNA to create a partial profile. Tessa stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. She cross-checked it with national databases, but no immediate match appeared. So she turned to genealogical mapping, a new approach that compared genetic similarities to public family history networks. After years of silence, the case had begun to breathe again. Within weeks, one partial match appeared, a distant relative, connected to a family still living in Pennsylvania. That clue would open a door that had remained closed for 41 years. The new team gathered in the evidence lab that afternoon, surrounding the monitor as Tessa explained the results. "This isn't direct," she said, "but it narrows the field. We can trace through family branches and see who lived near Millhaven at the time. Detective Robert Keller, who led the Cold Case Division, nodded. Let's find them all. Anyone connected to this branch, we talk to them. Over the next 2 months, the investigation expanded through records, birth certificates, and public archives. Patterns began to emerge, names that repeated, addresses that intersected. By early 2022, one stood out. A man named Michael Rowan, now in his 60s, had lived just outside Millhaven in 1980. He had worked as a part-time maintenance helper at the county library system, covering occasional shifts at nearby branches, including Millhaven. When detectives found his old employment records, something clicked. The dates matched Clara's work schedule that fall. And yet, Michael Rowan had never appeared in the original reports. Detective Keller stared at the paper for a long moment before saying quietly, "Looks like the past just spoke." Tessa ran the DNA comparison again, this time using Rowan's family connections as reference points. The numbers aligned with precision. The likelihood of a match was nearly absolute. After 41 years, Millhaven's unanswered questions had found their first whisper of truth. Detective Robert Keller leaned back in his chair, the soft hum of the cold case unit filling the air around him. For years, he had reviewed old files, names, faces, and evidence that time had nearly erased, but something about the Clara Vance case felt different. It carried a quiet weight, the kind that stayed in the room long after the file was closed. Across the table, forensic specialist Tessa Rhodes spread out her printed data. "It's the strongest lead we've ever had," she said gently. "The DNA from the jacket and the fabric at the scene share a connection to the Rowan family line. It's distant, but with the new mapping models, we can narrow it down." Detective Keller nodded, glancing again at the typed name Michael Rowan highlighted in red. The man was 63 now, retired, living in the small town of Brimford, only an hour from Millhaven. Records showed that he had been a maintenance assistant in the county library system for less than a year in 1980. After that, he'd left the job and moved several times around the state. Keller took a slow breath. "Let's start quietly," he said. "We'll look at his movements, talk to a few people who knew him back then. No assumptions, just facts." Within days, the new investigation was underway. Detectives reached out to the current director of the county library system, who kept detailed archives dating back to the 1970s. Inside a dusty storage room, Keller and Tessa flipped through attendance ledgers and maintenance records. On one of the sheets dated September 1980, they found Rowan's signature, marking his shift at Millhaven Library just 2 days before Clara's disappearance. Tessa pointed to it softly. He was there. The next step was to locate him. Keller and his partner, Detective Lena Morales, drove to Brimford, where Rowan lived in a small, single-story home surrounded by pine trees. A mailbox leaned slightly near the gravel drive. When he opened the door, he appeared calm and polite, his hair silvered, his posture steady. "Mr. Rowan," Keller said, flashing his badge. "We're with the Pennsylvania Bureau of Investigation. We're reviewing some old county employment records and hopping to ask a few routine questions." Rowan invited them in, his voice even, his hands clasped together. He lived alone, the house neatly kept with shelves of books and tools arranged carefully in the corner. As they spoke, Keller noticed small details, the clock ticking precisely, the faint scent of polished wood, the orderliness of everything. When asked about his work in 1980, Rowan nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember that year. I worked at several libraries, fixing lights, repairing shelves, things like that. It was a long time ago." "Do you remember anyone named Clara Vance?" Morales asked gently. Rowan paused for a fraction of a second. The name sounds familiar. Maybe she worked at one of the branches. Keller studied him quietly. She worked in Millhaven. You had a shift there that week. Rowan's eyes shifted slightly toward the window. Yes, I think I remember being there once or twice. I'm sorry I can't help more. It's been over 40 years. The detectives thanked him for his time, exchanged cards, and left without pressing further. As they walked to the car, Morales turned to Keller. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Keller nodded. The hesitation, he knew her name. They didn't have direct proof yet, only genetic proximity and a signature on an old log, but it was enough to deepen their focus. Over the next several weeks, they gathered additional evidence, records of Rowan's vehicle ownership in 1980, gas station receipts, and archived county maintenance routes. One route placed him near Oak Lane the week Clara vanished. When the data reached the district attorney's office, the team was granted a search warrant to collect a voluntary DNA sample for comparison. Keller returned to Brimford one clear afternoon, accompanied by two uniformed officers. Rowan met them at the door, his expression cautious but calm. "Is this about the woman again?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Keller replied. "We're re-examining evidence. You can help us by providing a sample. It's entirely voluntary." Rowan looked at the paper, then at the detective. For a moment the room felt still. Finally he nodded. "Of course, I have nothing to hide." The swab was taken carefully, sealed, and driven straight to the state lab in Harrisburg. Tessa began the analysis the same evening, her focus sharp despite the late hour. As the machine processed the sequence, the fluorescent lights above hummed softly. Hours passed, each second drawn out in quiet suspense. At 2:17 a.m., the monitor beeped. A perfect alignment appeared on the screen. The DNA from the jacket matched Rowan's sample with complete certainty. Tessa stared at the result, her heart pounding. She double-checked every control, every index. There was no doubt. The next morning, Keller received her call. Her voice trembled slightly but carried clarity. "We have the match." For a long moment, Keller said nothing. Then, with calm precision, he replied, "File the report. We'll move forward." By afternoon, an arrest warrant was issued. Keller and Morales returned to Brimford quietly, accompanied by local officers. When Rowan opened the door, he didn't speak. Keller explained the warrant, the confirmation, the results that tied him to a piece of evidence preserved for 43 years. Rowan listened in silence, his gaze steady. Finally, he said only, "I see." He was taken into custody without resistance. The neighbor stood behind curtains as the cars pulled away. At the Millhaven Police Department, word traveled fast. Officers who had been children when Clara disappeared gathered in the hallway, whispering softly. The town that had waited decades for answers finally had a name, though the emotions were mixed: relief, surprise, reflection. Detective Keller called Daniel Vance that evening. Daniel, now in his 60s, answered the phone with a cautious tone. "Detective Keller, it's been years since I heard that name." Keller spoke gently. "We've made an arrest in Clara's case. The evidence confirmed a match. It's over now." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, filled with calm gratitude. "She can rest now," he said, "and so can we." The following week, the news reached the local paper. Millhaven case reopened and solved after 4 decades. Arrest made in 1980 investigation. People left small bouquets near the library steps again, just as they had in the early days of the search. A candlelight gathering was held near the creek, where the plaque in Clara's memory still stood. Detective Morales noticed how the community came together not in grief, but in remembrance. "It's like they never stopped caring," she said softly. Keller nodded. "Some stories wait until the right hands open them." In court, as pretrial proceedings began, the evidence was presented in sequence. Photographs of the preserved fabric, the DNA charts, and the old maintenance logs told a story of persistence and quiet resolve. There were no harsh exchanges, no raised voices, only careful recounting of what time and science had finally revealed. Tessa Rhodes testified about the genetic mapping, explaining how new technology had identified family connections once invisible. "The sample was small," she said, "but intact enough to speak after 40 years. It just needed someone to listen." Daniel attended each session, sitting quietly in the front row, his hands folded around the same silver pen that had been found near Clara's bag. During one recess, he approached Keller and Tessa. "Thank you," he said simply. "You didn't know her, but you carried her story as if you did." Tessa smiled softly. She deserved to be heard. Outside, the trees around the courthouse swayed gently, their branches heavy with early spring leaves. Time had moved on, but the story that once seemed forgotten had found its way back into the light. As the case proceeded, the people of Millhaven began to reflect not only on what was lost, but also on what had been preserved: the notes, the care, the small acts of duty that kept the evidence safe for decades. Detective Keller visited the original library site one quiet morning. The building had been remodeled, but the old reading tables and the smell of paper remained the same. He stood by the window where Clara had once sorted books and whispered softly, "You were never really gone." Behind him, a librarian placed a small photograph frame on a shelf, a picture of Clara smiling with children during a summer reading program, taken just months before 1980. The frame caught the sunlight and shimmered. The long wait was almost over, but one final chapter still waited to be written: the verdict and the legacy it would leave behind. The courthouse in Harrisburg was calm that June morning in 2023. Pale sunlight filtered through tall windows, warming the polished wooden benches. Journalists, residents of Millhaven, and state investigators filled the room quietly, each person aware that they were witnessing the close of a story that had stretched across generations. At the front of the courtroom sat Michael Rowan, composed but silent, hands resting on the table before him. Behind him, detectives Robert Keller and Lena Morales took their seats beside forensic specialist Tessa Rhodes, who had traveled from the state lab to testify again. Near the front row, Daniel Vance sat still, a folded handkerchief in one hand and Clara's silver pen in the other. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The sound of chairs scraping the floor echoed softly before quiet settled once more. The prosecution began carefully, explaining the long chain of evidence that had brought them here. "This case began in 1980, the attorney said clearly. "Through dedication, preservation, and advances in forensic science, it has found its conclusion today." He guided the jury through the timeline: the preserved fabric, the matching genetic profile, the employment records linking Rowan to the Millhaven Library, and the consistent pattern of movement aligning with the night Clara vanished. When Tessa took the stand, her tone was calm and exact. The sample was recovered from a piece of cloth collected in 1980. It was stored correctly, undisturbed for over 40 years. Using modern sequencing, we identified a complete match to the DNA sample voluntarily provided by Mr. Rowan. There is no room for uncertainty. Her quiet professionalism filled the room with gravity. The defense chose not to contest the DNA evidence, focusing instead on the passage of time and the reliability of memory. But the facts remained firm, the data clear, the records intact. The weight of patience, care, and preservation over decades had built an unshakable foundation. As witnesses spoke, the courtroom felt suspended between past and present. Retired Detective Elaine Porter, now in her 70s, appeared by video testimony from her home. Her voice carried warmth and grace. "I promised Clara's brother I would never let her file be forgotten," she said. "I'm grateful that someone younger had the tools to finish what we began." Her words drew quiet smiles from Keller and Morales. During closing arguments, the prosecutor turned toward the jury, his tone soft but resolute. "Time can hide the truth, but it cannot erase it. This case reminds us that patience and care matter, that what we protect today can speak for those who no longer can." The courtroom fell silent as the judge gave final instructions. Then the jury retired. Hours passed. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound filling the still air. When the jury returned, everyone rose again. The foreperson held the verdict slip, reading aloud with clear voice. "We find the defendant, Michael Rowan, guilty." For a moment, no one moved. Then a faint exhale spread across the courtroom, a release built over 43 years. Daniel Vance closed his eyes. His hands trembled, not from grief, but from the quiet recognition that the story had finally found its peace. Later, outside the courthouse, he spoke briefly to reporters gathered near the steps. His words were gentle. "Clara's kindness shaped this town. What happened to her never changed that. It only made us remember how precious light can be." The people of Millhaven welcomed the news not with celebration, but with reflection. For many, it was a reminder of their shared endurance, a community that had waited decades for clarity, never losing its quiet hope. Detective Keller returned to Millhaven a few weeks later, visiting the spot near the library where a small garden had been planted years ago in Clara's memory. The daisies and mint she once tended had been replaced with lilies, bright and strong. He stood there a long while, listening to the distant hum of summer cicadas. When Tessa visited later that summer, she brought with her a framed certificate from the Bureau, recognizing the case as one of the state's longest resolved through forensic genealogy. The plaque read simply, "In honor of perseverance, compassion, and the enduring voice of truth." Daniel accepted it quietly, placing it on the library's front wall. Below it, the original plaque with Clara's name still shone in soft gold letters. Over time, the story of the investigation became part of Millhaven's history. Local teachers spoke about it in classes focused on science and community. Students learned how small acts of care, labeling an envelope correctly, keeping a file intact, could someday carry enormous meaning. Detective Keller, nearing retirement, often spoke at the police academy about the case. He told new officers that justice was not always loud or fast. "Sometimes," he would say, "it's the quiet work that endures, the files you don't forget, the promises you keep." In the state lab, Tessa continued her work, inspired by what the case had shown her. On quiet evenings, when the machines hummed and the city lights flickered beyond the windows, she often thought about Clara, not as a file or a number, but as a young woman who had loved books and laughter and small-town life. She kept a small pressed daisy taped to the corner of her computer monitor, a reminder that stories can bloom again, even after decades of silence. Each year, on the anniversary of the case's resolution, Millhaven held a simple gathering near the library steps. People brought candles, letters, and photographs. There was no sorrow in their words, only gratitude. The children who had once asked their parents about the mystery now brought their own children, showing them where history and hope had met. During one of those gatherings, Daniel stood near the garden and spoke softly to the crowd. When we waited, we never waited alone, he said. Every person who cared, every hand that kept a file safe, every heart that remembered, that's what carried Clara home. His words drifted through the warm air, settling like sunlight on the gathered faces. As twilight deepened, the candles flickered gently against the darkening sky. The town stood together, not in mourning, but in calm unity, a community that had learned how patience and goodness could bridge even the longest silence. The courthouse documents were later archived in the state's permanent records, labeled as Case PA 1980CLV, solved 2023. On the final page, Detective Keller had written a short note before submitting the file for storage. Justice fulfilled through kindness and care, memory preserved. Years later, new generations walked the quiet streets of Millhaven, often unaware of how deeply the town had once waited for peace. But those who remembered told the story with warmth, about the librarian who loved books, the detectives who never stopped believing, and the science that finally brought her voice back into the light. In the end, the story of Clara Vance was no longer one of loss, but of lasting connection. The daisies in the library garden bloomed each year without fail. Their white petals opened toward the morning sun, bright and still, whispering softly in the breeze that passed through the heart of Millhaven, a town that had once waited for answers and finally found them.